around the clock, sports all the time. That's never going to work. That's ridiculous.
Just remember to have fun out there today. And if you lose, I'll kill you.
This is Tall Can Audio.
Seriously, this thing is going to be a cultural disaster.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome inside a brand new edition of the Tall Can Audio podcast for your Monday. Hope you all had a fantastic weekend. This is going to be one of those ones, I guess, we've sort of taken to calling a TCA freak show. Lots of pieces, lots of moving parts, lots of things to be dropped in and out, recorded at different points, and then, well, dropped in here for you. Hope you're all right with that. We are on social media at Tall Can Audio. Give us a follow there. And make sure you're subscribed to the pod wherever you're hearing us right now. If you missed it last week, some great stuff. We had our buddy Scott MacArthur, formerly of TSN 1050. And after that, the Sportsnet morning show. Well, the Fan 590 morning show, they call it now. Sportsnet radio, whatever. The way I swing that away and brush that away is almost exactly the way Scotty Mac did while he was working there. And he's had plenty of things to say about that over the years, and wasn't shy about it this time. Go back a little further than that. Keegan Matheson was here to talk about his new book, The Franchise, Toronto Blue Jays. Kevin Mickey was here to co-host last Monday. Look, as you all know, I've been pushed out of the studio here for a little bit, and this is the end of that. This is the last show recorded away from the studio. I will be headed home on Monday, probably as you're hearing this, and, starting to put things back together outside the studio, inside the studio, and we can kind of get back on track from there. So appreciate y'all for sticking with me. But, on Mondays, typically, we try and have a co-host here. These solo shows that I do are typically reserved for kind of midweek, random topics here and there. Try not to do it on Mondays, but, here we are. As things have remained in flux, I wasn't sure exactly what the weekend was going to look like. And exactly when I was going to be able to get back into the studio. So a couple of things recorded for you throughout the weekend at different points. Like I said, they're just going to be dropped in here. My thoughts on, the Stanley Cup Final, the Mitch Marner thing. Actually, a couple of thoughts on Bonnaroo being canceled and what's gone into that and what it might mean moving forward. But look, just because it's a bit of a TCA freak show does not mean I'm not having a pint, because that would be really freaky. And I just don't want to live in a world where there's a Monday edition of the Tall Can Audio podcast without a beer. Father's Day, I don't know why, but Father's Day felt like a day for a stout. And so this is the chocolate milk stout. I've had it before. Chocolate milk stout from Brock Street Brewing down in Whitby. 5.5%. Not a bad way to wind down a weekend here. Hope your weekend looked good. I spent mine mostly, hiding out, enjoying those last couple days at the cottage. And the sun finally came out, finally started to warm up. It was a nice couple of days to spend around the cottage. I did get to spend a little bit of time with some nieces and nephews. Of course, with my dad, which was kind of cool. I don't always get to see him on Father's Day. But I got to say, I told myself when I sat down to do the show today, I wasn't going to comment on this. I didn't want to get into it. Because sometimes there's nothing worse than seeing people shitting on something and then taking the opportunity to shit on those people for shitting on something. And yet that's exactly what I'm going to do. I guess we probably won't do it for another year or so, but can we make a promise to ourselves that and to each other that in 2026, we won't define Father's Day for other people? I'm incredibly lucky. I grew up in a very stable household, a very traditional household, a mom and a dad, a couple of sisters, and everything was great. My parents were fantastic. I'm a very lucky guy. And I don't want this to be framed as other family structures that I'm about to paint here were any less lucky. Some were, some weren't. Some were designed that way. But we have a lot of different looking families these days. And I saw so much online on Sunday about people laying down the rules. Father's Day is about your biological father, and that's it, and everybody else can go away. Father's Day is about you and your children, and that's it, and everybody else can go away. People trying to lay it down that, like, it's only for men. Like, if you had a big brother or an uncle or a stepfather who stepped in for you alongside, your traditional father figure, those people are okay and nothing else. Like, trying to draw lines. And obviously it comes from a fairly discriminatory place. Like, first of all, I don't understand why this is important to you, to care what other people think of on Father's Day. As I said, I grew up in a fairly traditional household. I think of my dad and how lucky I was to have a father figure like that who was always there for us and provided for the family. And, I don't even know how to dig into it. It's fairly traditional. It's fairly standard, right? That's not the only way this works. I saw somebody specifically targeting single mothers and saying, you honor them on Mother's Day, not on Father's Day. Well, you know what? If your dad left or your dad passed away or whatever situation you might be in, and you wake up on Father's Day thinking about, thank God for my mom and how she helped teach me to play catch, or, if Father's Day makes you think about how lucky and how above and beyond your mom went for you, I don't understand what's wrong with that. I don't understand why anyone else needs to have an opinion on that. If you have two moms and they did their best to learn boy things for you, or there's a million different family structures right now, and it really bums me out that on Father's Day, there aren't just people out there saying, here's a picture of me and my dad, and happy Father's Day, and thank God for this guy, and happy Father's Day to all the dads out there and stuff. You have to draw lines. There are people out there saying, no, only these people count. Only traditional biological father figures count. Or only men count. Or only... Just let people celebrate these occasions with whoever and however it means to them or comes to them, honestly. I started this out, like I said, I wasn't even going to get into this today because it was making me mad. The more I talk about it, the more it just bums me out. Like, I don't know what's going wrong in your life if you have to define Father's Day for somebody else. If you wake up that day and you're thinking of this person and want to call them or want to spend time with them, or by all means, maybe you've got a much older brother who had to step in for the family. Maybe you got two dads, and I don't know. At that point, it seems pretty easy, right? Should be a lot of gifts, lots of things going on. I just hate the idea that we have to define these things and only our own definition counts. Because I am a very standard, a mom, a dad, a couple of kids. It's exactly what it would look like in a 1980s sitcom, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. And yet I couldn't possibly be less bothered if somebody else sees Father's Day in a different light and wants to thank their grandfather or wants to thank their uncle or wants to thank, whatever, their single mother, whatever it might be. Just leave people alone. Just let people do their own thing. You do your thing. Enjoy it. Have a good time. But in 2026, let's try harder to not define Father's Day or any other holiday through only the lens with which we see it, because it's not a wide enough lens. Before we get into a couple of the other things I pre-recorded throughout the weekend, I did see on Sunday afternoon, and I'm not sure how relevant this is going to be. I'm not sure how interested you guys are going to be, but Elliot Friedman tweeted out that the Olympic teams that have already qualified for the 2026 games in Milan in hockey will unveil throughout the day on Monday 6 players each that will represent these teams. And we sort of had this conversation leading into the, what do we call it? The Four Nations. Last May or June, whenever it was, maybe it was April. It was sometime during the playoffs. Each of the participating teams had to name 6 or 8 players. And we have seen this before at the Olympics. Before 1998, you had to name a certain number of guys ahead of time. In 2002, certainly it did. And that stands out to me because I remember the 8 players they named, perhaps off the top of my head, but we're not going to try and run it down here. And I remember Gretzky who was running the team, putting it together, being asked, did you know that 7 of the 8 guys you named in your first 8 were all captains? And he said, well, we hadn't thought of that, but, happy to see it. We're pretty reassured by it. It's going to be a good leadership group. And I can't remember what they did in 2006 because I'm one of those stereotypical Canadian hockey fans that, like, if we don't do well, I just throw it overboard. Who cares? The selection process, whatever went into it. I do remember the announcement that Eric Stahl, Sidney Crosby, and Jason Spezza were going to be the 3 taxi squad guys who weren't going to the tournament. But I do remember some small little thing acknowledging them. But in 2010, I think we did away with naming 6 or 8 ahead of everybody else. In 2014, I think we did away with naming 6 or 8 ahead of everyone else. And I know for fact in 2018 and 2022, they did away with it. And this is all about marketing. We talked about this before the 4 Nations. This is so we can start putting some posters up. We can start putting names on things. We can start selling jerseys ahead of time. We can start hyping this. And that, I get it. I understood it when this was an NHL process building up to an NHL tournament. But this is the Olympics now. This is not an NHL event, although they try very hard to make it into one. And I understand. I do believe the NHL should have the right to use those video clips, which is something they've complained about a long time, not having access to Sidney Crosby's 2010 goal and things like that. If we're going to let our players go, we're going to risk our players getting hurt. We need to have a little something in return. But the idea of naming 6 players, 8 months ahead of time, 7 months ahead of time, whatever the hell we are, is brutal team building. And look no further than Brad Marchand, who is killing it right now in the Stanley Cup Final. May have surpassed Sam Bennett as the odds-on favorite to win the Conn Smythe. When he was named last spring, everyone kind of went, yeah, okay. And it even made sense from a standpoint of half the tournament's going to be played in Boston. We think Marchand's going to be on the team anyway. Why not throw him in that early group? We can start putting some billboards up around Boston and marketing the thing around him. Fine. The whole tournament was a throw-together corporate thing anyway. And look, I enjoyed it. You enjoyed it. It turned out to be a good tournament. But going into it, this was our thought process, right? Was fine. It's just a corporate schmooze anyway. So sure, throw Brad Marchand into it. Do you remember what the talk about Brad Marchand was through October and November and December? While the Bruins were spiraling out, he looked old. He looked slow. If we were naming the team in total in early December, instead of having 6 or 8 guys having been named months earlier, Brad Marchand would not have made that team. And he looked at the tournament at times like he didn't belong on that team. You remember, Brad Marchand did not stand out at that tournament. You're kind of like, well, guy had a good run. Hall of Fame career. It didn't pan out, but this is what happens when you ask people to start naming members of their team, but not all of their team, months in advance. We pick guys that are easy to market around. They fall off and get old, and now he doesn't belong at this tournament. And where did we end up just a couple months after that? Him killing it in the Stanley Cup playoffs, killing it in the Stanley Cup finals, and maybe winning a Conn Smythe. Things change too fast. You should not be asking these hockey federations to name part of their team this far in advance. And you can try and make an argument that it's like, well, they obviously wanted to make a big splash, a big impact. Did you know this announcement was coming? Because I didn't. I knew the 4 Nations one was coming. They made it clear they would announce these teams at a certain point last spring, and we all knew it was coming. We talked about it on the show leading up. Lots of sports outlets did. Who would you put in your top 6? Who would you put in your top 8? Look, I am not unfoulable, as you all know, infallible. I may have just fouled in not knowing whether it's infallible or unfallible. I think it's infallible. I'm a pretty plugged in sports guy. I did not know this was happening on Monday, and I doubt Elliot Friedman tweets that out on a random Sunday afternoon unless he feels like this is going to be newsworthy. People don't know this is coming. You don't build a team this way. You build a team by putting everyone through the same process, working them all together, allowing them to make the team at the same time, enjoy the selection process at the same time. You don't go, we have tiers of guys. Here's our top tier. And then, yeah, I guess in December, we'll get around to naming everyone else. That sucks. That's shit. That's a terrible way to build team chemistry. And I'm not saying it puts anybody at a disadvantage because all these teams are being forced to do it. But we're back in a situation. And look, I don't want to I don't want to pick on Brad Marchand. Everybody knows he's not my favorite guy. When he was picked last spring for the Four Nations team, yeah, everyone went, yeah, that's fine. Had a pretty good year. Then he had a really bad start. You were like, this guy shouldn't be on the team. And really, he wasn't that good on the team. Then all of a sudden, he's bounced back. He's another year older. Would you put him in that top 6 on Monday and make him one of your first announcements? You're playing with father time a little bit. And in Team Canada's case, it's really probably not all that important. You can still go McDavid, McKinnon, Crosby, Makar, whatever you want. Reinhart, Devin Taves. Sure, there's 6. And then do the rest of it later. But there are other teams that aren't as deep that these are big decisions for, right? Like, we don't know. This bugs me that this just dropped into everybody's lap on a random Sunday. Like, by the way, part of your Olympic team's getting announced tomorrow. I haven't seen anyone talking about that for weeks. And look, I don't think I'm the only one. We see TSN and Sportsnet do their projections all the time. There's been nothing about that. And that's with a Stanley Cup Final that's taking like 3, 4, 5 days off in between games. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit. But you should be filling some of that airspace with speculation on these Olympic teams, unless they didn't know either. And that's what I'm taking away from this, is they didn't know either. This is just something that got, probably the federations knew, but hasn't been teed up by Sportsnet, hasn't been teed up by the NHL, hasn't been promoted to the public. Get ready. We haven't seen NHLers in the Olympics since 2014. This is going to be a huge deal. By the way, we'll announce part of it tomorrow. Hockey being hockey. Can't get their shit together. That bugs me. Just dropped out of nowhere on a June afternoon and Sunday. You're going to hear part of your team tomorrow. Anyway, I mentioned this is a bit of a freak show. Let's jump into some of the other things that I pre-recorded throughout the weekend before I head back into the studio this week, and we start to get things back on track and taking place a little more normally than they have been here over the last couple of weeks.
And Shooter's not about to let his reign at the top be spoiled by some freak sideshow clown.
Did you just call me a freak?
So I was reading over the weekend about how Bonnaroo, the music festival down in Tennessee, I'm not sure I knew until this weekend that it was held in Manchester, Tennessee. I definitely did not know there was a Manchester, Tennessee. The Manchester that I am aware of is in England. And if there are 2 places on earth that I imagine to be more culturally different than Manchester, England, and Manchester, Tennessee, I can't think of them off the top of my head. But I guess the bulk of the festival got canceled because of extreme weather. And I guess rain and whatever else had turned, well, the beautiful farm fields of Manchester, Tennessee, not for the first time, into a bit of a mud pit. And we've seen this before, and I couldn't remember exactly where, because reading about this had sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole as to, what caused this. And there was some comments in one of the news articles I read that was talking about this becoming more and more common. And I knew I'd seen it somewhere, but, the article goes on to talk about, insurance for these sorts of music festivals and the increasing logistical difficulties of holding summer outdoor music festivals in a world that is increasingly on fire. And so I ended up going down this rabbit hole, and I went searching for, I knew there was one in my head. I know you can think of it too right now. Everybody online was sort of making fun of these people because it's known as being a bit of a douchey, for lack of a better term, festival. But that's not narrowing it down much, right? We've seen lots of, douchey music festivals. Perhaps Bonnaroo was going to be one of them. And I don't know why I find that term so funny. I'm sort of a man I'm sort of a man. There, I've admitted it. I'm kind of a man. I'm a guy, a white dude in his early 40s, and I don't know what Bonnaroo is. I don't know what it means. I know it's a music festival now, but there's a part of me that always sits back and thinks that it's like a very excited, or an indication of a very excited Australian animal. Like, it's marsupial mating season, and you can tell by that animal's glorious Bonnaroo. How is this show worse when it's just me? How is it more inappropriate? How is it more immature when it should just be one guy sitting and talking? These are the things that run through my head. It was Burning Man, and I had actually Googled mudslide canceled music fest 2024, trying to find the one that I was thinking of, and it turns out that it was Burning Man in fall of 2023. But based on the criteria that I had punched in to look for it, it had a whole bunch of canceled music fests in 2024. A lot of them EDM, which I guess, again, for those of you like me, just men in your early 40s, I guess that's a type of music. It is not just the short form for the Oilers, who are watching in the Stanley Cup Final right now. There were EDM music festivals canceled. Lots by rain, lots by, mud just being created all over the place. It was another place I saw, or another festival I saw, that was called Big Red Bash, which I thought was just what happened if you mouthed off at home around the wrong time of the anyway. Look, it seems this has become a bit of a thing, and so I ended up reading this really interesting piece, which we'll link to in the show notes, from Rolling Stone, and it's from last summer, but talking about last summer's touring. Like, it was sort of a spin-off. A spin-off's the wrong way to put it, but like the successor to Warped Tour, which was always sort of a punk, pop punk, skate punk touring festival back when I was, younger, if nothing else. And this one was called Summer School. And they had been having trouble getting off the ground because it was becoming so hard to schedule outdoor places to be. The hurricane season is arriving earlier and earlier. If you remember, in 2024, the first category, or the earliest Category 5 on record, hit the United States, and it destroyed like half of Florida. Ended up making its way up to North Carolina, and did a ton of damage. So they're trying to schedule, okay, we got to get earlier, but people are still in school and people are still working. They're not on summer vacation yet. So we don't really want to be in the Southeast during hurricane season, which does now last through the summer and into September. We don't really want to be in Phoenix and Texas and California and places like that when it's 110 degrees through July and August. So how do you put your tour together? How do you put your schedule together? And they started talking about this idea of cancellation insurance, which, look, that makes sense. If you're a touring artist, you never know what's going to happen. Maybe there's a problem at the arena you're doing or whatever. But more and more often, you're canceling tours, and you're seeing it's not just festivals, it's individual tours. They referenced Pink and how she was supposed to have while she did the East Coast leg of her tour, the equipment that she used on the West Coast be on a boat through the Panama Canal last summer and over to Europe. And if you recall, last summer we started hearing that the Panama Canal couldn't handle all that many boats. The lake that feeds it and allows all the water in was way too low, having drought conditions, and so they ended up flying her equipment over at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars to fly it to Europe, only to, when they get there to try and load into the festival she was going to play, have to cancel it down because Belgium had a tornado. And Belgium, not known for its tornadoes, so that was problematic. And so you start canceling these things, and things start to get more expensive. And one of the things I remember standing out to me as I'm reading about all this is like the first guy in the replies talking about the cost of insurance, both for festival promoters and artists on one end, like if they have to cancel for some reason, to make sure that, you know, all those refunds and everything isn't going to land directly in their lap, but also the venues themselves. And perhaps not surprisingly, the insurance companies are saying, hey, a concert on Miami Beach in September is going to cost you more to insure than the one in Chicago in September, where there probably won't be a hurricane today. And the first reply, because there's always a hooplehead in the replies going, well, these artists are making millions and Ticketmaster is making millions, and you know what? They can just eat it. You're like, yeah, that's probably what they'll do. They'll probably just eat it. They definitely won't pass it on to you. And like I said, the one that stood out to me was this summer school festival, which was like I said, a traveling kind of punk rock. Well, I think it's punk rock. It's supposed to be the successor to the Warped Tour. I looked at all the band names, and I'm not even trying to be a dick. I don't know a single one of them. Which is funny, because at the age that I was going to Warped Tour, if I had put a list of bands in front of my dad that I was into, he wouldn't have known a single one of them. So this is just the thing that happens to you. It kind of sucks. There was a time where I thought I was reasonably knowledgeable and hip to new music, and boy, oh boy, is that time gone. But like, they're talking to this guy, and he's saying, you know what? One of the co-promoters was a guy who used to be involved in Warped Tour from like 96 to 2008 or whatever it was. He goes, places that we used to schedule to go to that were 95 degrees in July are now 110. And you can't do it. You cannot do it. And he said, try and convince an artist. We're going to go do a 40-date tour, and you'll be outside, and as often as not, it'll be 110 degrees. Just physically, you can't do it day after day. I don't know why this has got me so wound up. I just found it really interesting to think of like this thing that we've all known forever, these outdoor touring music fests, even if they're not touring, you know, even if it is Osheaga in Montreal or Bonnaroo down in apparently Tennessee, Burning Man, I guess is becoming entirely too literal. Look, you can't do it. And they're starting to dry up. And maybe this is just not one of those things that they're going to be able to continue. Or, I don't know, can you do them in the fall? Like, half the fun of Warped Tour was you showed up at noon. They didn't tell you ahead of time what order the bands were going to be on. And it was supposed to create equal exposure for the bands you'd never heard of and the bands that were sort of headlining. Like, maybe the Vandals would be on at 4 p.m. and, you know, the Salads, a local band at a Whitby, would be on at 8 p.m., right, as sort of a closing act or a headlining act. And it was a really cool kind of democratic way of getting exposure to everybody. And it forced you to show up early. Like, I would be going to see, you know, whatever it might be. The last time I went, in 2004, speaking of heat and how all this works, I missed almost all of the Newfound Glory set because the girl that I was there with was dealing with heat stroke. And I remember it was about 28, 29 degrees that day. More muggy and humid than sunny and really hot. But if you've ever been to a show like that, like, even if you're not right in the mosh pit, it is shoulder to shoulder. You know, it is hot. And she's like 5'3", so she's not getting up for air anyway. And yeah, like we get like a third of the way through that show and she's sort of like leaning on me more and more, and she's got to get out of there. We got to go find some water and some shade. I still resent her a little for it, to be honest with you. Missed Newfound Glory was one of the bands I had gone to see. But that's in Barrie, Ontario in August in 2004. You got kids going down with heat stroke. What does it look like in Phoenix, Arizona in July of 2025? It sure sounds like we are seeing the end of the summer festival. And it may take some time, but they're going to get canceled more and more often. Like, this is, I guess, the third time in like 5 years that at least parts of Bonnaroo have been canceled. You know, we talked about Burning Man. We talked about some of these other Big Red Bash and EDM festivals and this and that. If Belgium has tornadoes, you should probably get over the idea that you're ever going to be able to predict what the weather's going to be like when you plan your music festival. Because that shit's not supposed to happen.
Woohoo! You like the freaky stuff, huh? That's cool. Well, I can be naughty too. Real freaking naughty.
Ugh, Brad Marchand and Sam Bennett have become the first set of teammates since 1973. Yvonne Cornwallis and Frank Mahovlich to each score 5 goals in a Stanley Cup Final, and it's just gross. Like, it's just gross. Like, if we're sitting here, and as I'm sitting here, it's about 11 o'clock Saturday night, just getting some of the thoughts on Game 5 of the Stanley Cup Final off my chest here before shutting it down for the night. And if we were sitting here and it was like Sam Reinhart and Alex Barkov each had 5 goals, you're like, all right, well, good for those guys, I guess, or somebody else up and down the lineup, right? I know a lot of people listening to this are sort of on the Edmonton Oilers or Connor McDavid bandwagon, and that's reasonable enough. So you're never going to love to see the Florida Panthers putting up a statistic like that, but you're just like, these two guys, eh? It's got to be Sam Bennett and Brad Marchand. Fuck. Oilers down 3-2, and look, I think I've talked about this on the show. I've had a little trouble getting into this series, and it's possible that this is just a prolonged sulk session for me, as we've talked about before. Normally, the Leafs lose in the first round, so I fuck off and sulk in the second round. And then as the conference finals creep along, I kind of make my way back in and re-engage with the playoffs. But this year, they didn't lose till the second round, and so I sort of took a lot of the conference finals off, and maybe it's just that's lingering a little longer. But I don't think it is, and honestly, I've talked about this already. Like, I saw the Florida Panthers and their style win last year, and, you know, good for them. They were full value for it. They did just about deuce the bed unbelievably hard in the Stanley Cup Final. But they clinched their cheeks hard enough at the last possible second to hold on and grab a cup. So we get the rematch this year. And as I said here, and as I've said in other places, I don't really care if the Oilers win, right? Like, I'm not one of those guys who gets all into the last Canadian team standing. My rooting interest in this is strictly, I think the best player in the world should hoist a Stanley Cup at some point. We saw Lemieux do it. We saw Crosby do it. We saw Gretzky do it. Connor McDavid should do it. But he's not... I don't want to say he's not doing anything. He's out there, and he did score on Saturday night. But that was his first goal of the series, and we're 5 games into this thing. And last year he was a house of fire, and he broke Gretzky's assist record, and he won the Conn Smythe in a losing effort, and he swore on Amazon Prime TV, and all of this shit. And I was more compelled by that. He, as my only reason to root for the Oilers in this series, hasn't done enough for me to really go, man, that guy is on fire. That guy is digging in and dragging them kicking and screaming to a Stanley Cup. Now, That's not all his job. He is one guy. He is the best player in the world. We all know that. He is capable of putting that team on his back and dragging them a long way. But, it's not all his job. But we've seen Draisaitl step up and score some big goals, including the overtime winner in Game 4, which was incredible. But there's something about this series that for some reason to me feels less compelling than even the early part of last year. And last year, Florida was up 3-0. And in Game 4, Edmonton came out and won at home 8-1 and forced it back to Florida. And even then, that felt like, Edmonton's final stand or whatever before going down to Florida to lose, which isn't what happened. They put up a fight, drove it to 7. They were full value for it. I feel like this series is less competitive than that, which is a ridiculous thing to say. We've had 3 out of 5 games go to overtime. And going into Saturday night, it was tied at 2. But this has felt all series long to me like it was kind of just waiting for the inevitable. The Panthers have been the better team throughout the season, even though both of these teams kind of did what really good teams do, and that's, get hot when you have to, coast when you want to, kind of do what you got to do to just get in and then turn over the engine and get going. Florida certainly did that against Tampa. I don't know what you'd want to call it against Toronto. Did they let their foot off the gas a little bit? Did Toronto actually push them? I don't know, but when it mattered, they blew Toronto away, and then they blew Carolina away. Edmonton, the engine stalled a little bit in round 1, and they found themselves down 0-2 to LA, and a lot of us were going, hey, see, told you, this LA team was flush, and Edmonton had been unstoppable ever since. And we get these two teams again in the final, and when I'm looking at it, I'm not finding it as compelling as a lot of other people who are wondering if this is like the best Stanley Cup Final ever. That talk has cooled a little, after, what was it, Game 3 that was fairly not compelling. Game 5 was not overly compelling. There's something about this series. I look at it and I say, I am waiting for the inevitable. And that is for Florida to get this done and repeat again. And I feel silly even saying it because all Edmonton's got to do is win 2 in a row. And they can do that. Hell, they almost won 4 in a row against the Panthers last year in the final. But there's just something about this Panthers team that feels even better again. And maybe it is Brad Marchand, a rat face himself. Not a fan, as you guys would assume. But he has become just the 7th player in NHL history to score 5 goals in 2 separate Stanley Cup finals. And I think he's up to 7 now. I think that stat was going into tonight where he scored 2 more. So, pretty good. And look, when he played in 2011 and when he played in 2019, he was a younger gentleman. And I guess as we all were when we look back a couple of years. But this guy was brought in for a second-round pick at 37 years old, and he has been absolutely lights out for them. A Conn Smythe candidate. Like I mentioned off the top of this segment, he and Bennett both scoring 5 goals in the Stanley Cup Final, and being the first duo to do that since 1973. Bennett was sort of coming in as the presumptive Conn Smythe favorite for his team, right? When you're leading the playoffs in goals and then you continue to put up that pace in the finals by scoring another 5, and somehow it's Brad Marchand who's now, I don't know if that's a sentimental thing. I don't know if it's recency bias where we kind of lean towards, hey, let's give it to the guy who had the big final. Like we always see a little bit of a slant towards who was best late, but Bennett's been consistent all the way through. And yet somehow it's Brad Marchand who, coming out of Game 5, after another couple of goals and really solidifying that third line with Lundell and Luosterainen, like there's just nobody's matching that, right? And the Oilers in Game 5 were a bit of a mess. Ekholm, 2 huge blunders early in the game. In the last 11 minutes of the first period, at home, in the last 11 minutes of a home first period, the Oilers didn't muster a shot. Like, you got to be better. You got to be more desperate. And they just didn't seem to have it going early enough. Like I said, McDavid finally gets his first of the series. That's great, but it was over. He gave it back 47 seconds later anyway. So what the hell difference did it make? Pickard over Skinner. Look, Pickard wasn't great, but Skinner hadn't been great either. I think there'll be a lot of second guessing, and look, that's what you do in hindsight, right? But I think there'll be a lot of second guessing after Game 5 that maybe you should have went back to Skinner. Skinner hadn't been getting it done either. And had they started Skinner and lost tonight, everyone would have said, see, you should have stuck with Pickard, who, was so good for you in the second and the third in Game 4. So, you were sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's easy to second guess now. I didn't hate the decision to start Calvin Pickard, but it didn't really work out. The first and the third goal against, you could probably make a pretty serious case for him having needed to have. So, I don't know. There's just something about this series that has not quite grabbed me. And yet, just as likely or just as easily that this could end on Tuesday in 6 back in Miami would not shock me at all. If we're doing this all over again, Game 7 back in Edmonton, Oilers home ice, and they get it done. That would still be my preference, but it's less of a strong preference than it was at the beginning of the series. Like I said, half of the fun was I want to see McDavid hoist the cup, but I wanted along the way to see McDavid do an awful lot of McDavid things and create crazy McDavid highlights and score wicked McDavid goals. And look, we have seen some pretty sweet setups, especially earlier in the series. But when it gets tight like this, he's got to step up, and he can't wait for it to be 3-0 before he does in a home Game 5. And look, that's just the pressure a superstar wears. You can think of whatever team you cheer for and go, look, if I was 5 games into a Stanley Cup Final and my best player hadn't scored a goal yet, he'd probably be pretty ripe for criticism. Speaking as a Leaf fan, I have had those thoughts a time or two before, but my team has never been this far where I've really had to worry about it in a Stanley Cup Final context.
All right, you listen up, you little freaks. Fun stops here.
Early last week, may have been late the week before. I can't remember the exact timeline on this now. But a minor hockey podcast out of Alberta started spouting off about Mitch Marner with insights that I can't possibly imagine are true any further than they are reasonably credible thoughts on what Mitch might do based on an outsider's reading. The way I might look at what's happened, the way you might look at what's happened, we can draw our own conclusions and say, I bet Mitch felt that way about this. And if that happened to me, this is how I'd feel about it. And you might be right. I might be right. But we don't know for sure that that's what was going on with Mitch. And this podcast made a bunch of traction. And look, I hate that shit. There's no reason to believe these people had any sources close to Mitch. As I said, this is an Alberta-based minor hockey podcast. When I say minor, I'm not describing the podcast as minor. I have no idea how big their listenership is. I'm saying they actually cover minor hockey, which on the face of it is kind of cool. Lots of people out doing NHL podcasts and Major League Sports podcasts and trying to break through and get noticed, and that's all fine. But often, if you can find a niche somewhere else that not a lot of people are covering, you might be able to make some hay there. So this isn't a shot at the podcast when I say it's an Alberta-based minor hockey podcast. I'm saying I'm going to need to hear some of the characterizations that this podcast put out on Twitter from somewhere a little more reputable, a little more close to home, places that we often hear this stuff. And this tweet that said, Mitch was insulted by, having not been offered this and, was really upset by the trade possibility to Carolina that he turned down. We have no way of knowing if that was true or not. But this tweet gets all kinds of traction, and Leaf fans who are already a little fired up about the Mitch thing and have been for a while start taking it as gospel, like it came from a Friedman or a McKenzie or a Dreger or, one of the Leafs beat reporters who might have actually spoken to him. And I just couldn't wrap my head around why so many people were taking this as the gospel. So many quote tweets and replies, then fuck this guy if that's how he feels, and if he signs in Carolina after turning down a trade from there, which is also a ridiculous argument. If you can't get your head around the fact that the guy wasn't going to accept a trade while his wife was 7 months pregnant to a new city, a new country, and then may end up there in free agency, that's a you problem. These are human beings, and while I'm irritated with Mitch, while I'm frustrated with his playoff output, I had no illusions whatsoever that guy was going to agree to have him and his 7 months pregnant wife uprooted, at the trade deadline this year, just months before he can pick his destination in free agency. So he may end up in Carolina, and I may be frustrated by that, but I will at least have the ability to zoom out and understand why it played out that way. So all these people are dunking on Mitch using this tweet and what a spoiled guy he is and fuck him for, any hurt feelings and all this sort of stuff. And there's no way of knowing that it's true. All this tweet served to do was to fire everybody up and get this, based on nothing, based on one Twitter account's speculation. It's one of the evils of Twitter, is just someone's opinion getting thrown out there as if it's fact, and everybody's off and running. So that finally fades away. And then on Friday, Andy Strickland, who covers the NHL and who is credible, he works out of St. Louis, has been covering the league for a very long time, is very well plugged in, very well connected. He tweets out that he can confirm Mitch Marner is leaving Toronto and will play for a new team next year. Now, he avoids all the speculation, all the characterization about his feelings on, requests to be traded and things like that. He just says he's leaving. And again, it gets everybody all fired up, and I'm sort of left wondering why. Like, at least this one is credible. When I say I'm not going to listen to some Alberta-based minor hockey podcast, I might listen to Andy Strickland. But Andy Strickland didn't say anything here, in my opinion, that we didn't already know. Like, I think most of us were, I guess you could make the argument that we were at like a 90% he's gone, and Andy's saying it's 100%. And I suppose that's somewhat newsy, but to get everybody fired up again in the middle of a Stanley Cup Final over something like that, and I'm not blaming Andy, although I do wonder what the value of the post was, other than certainly engagement, and it got that. Like I said, he's credible. I believe he's probably spoken to someone, and this is what he believes. I just think we already knew this. And so it fires up the debate again. It fires up the discussion again, and Friedman's got to talk about it on the next 32 Thoughts, that he thinks it might drag out a couple of days into free agency. Maybe he'll do the tour or, have some meetings with some of these teams before signing. And they compared it to the John Tavares thing. The difference was that John Tavares was, during that, frankly, very smart period that they implemented, where there was like 5 days before free agency where UFAs could talk to other teams, the legal tampering period. And you could visit cities and meet with people and get a handle on the way they envisioned your role on a new team. And then you could sign at 12:01 and everyone would go, well, that makes sense. Whereas now everyone signs at 12:01 on July 1st, and we're supposed to pretend that contracts get agreed upon that fast and nobody tampered. So if Mitch is going to do the tour or do the group of meetings or whatever, it will again infuriate Leaf fans that this is dragging out and being held as news and whatever else. And it will be news. He is the biggest UFA of the summer. But to have it dragged out, it will become another thing. But it will play out over July 1st, 2nd, 3rd. I can't imagine any of these insiders who've got like 8 hours of free agency coverage to do on July 1st are happy to hear he's considering not signing that day, as they all take off for their cottages after that day of coverage, those free agency specials. So I look at it though, and I wonder, are we going to do this every 3 or 4 days leading up to, I heard this about Mitch, and I've heard that about it, all the way to July 1st. Like I said, at least Andy Strickland is credible. It's a little odd that it comes from a guy, who's working mainly out of St. Louis, and that is his beat. But he has relationships around the league. Maybe he spoke to an agent. Maybe he knows one of Mitch's buddies. It could be anybody. Or it could be nothing. He could be mistaken. And I'm not trying to sit here and sell you that I think he might be coming back to Toronto. It appears that's off the table. I'm just sort of left wondering, what was so newsy about that on Friday? I think we all have sort of come to realize that his relationship with the Toronto Maple Leafs is over and he'll be gone. And now we have a St. Louis-based, insider or reporter saying, I can confirm that. You're like, okay, well, thanks for confirming that, I guess. But it was taken as breaking news, as I guess all things Leafs kind of are. It's a long divorce. It's messy. It's, sometimes you just got to rip the Band-Aid off. This was a slow motion car crash all the way through the regular season. And to his credit and to Leaf fans' credit, most of the time outside of kind of around trade deadline time, it was kept reasonably quiet. Once you got into the playoffs, there was some talk about it. Ottawa fans, chanting Mitch is leaving. Games 5 and 7 in round 2 after those Senators fans had been dispatched of. The car crash continued in an extremely violent way in games 5 and 7, where Mitch was not singularly responsible, but we see that backhand pass into the middle from just inside his blue line. The wheels sort of coming off for him, and you can see for sure, like, this is over, right? Like, this guy is gone. And it's not because I thought he was giving up in those games, but everything that we had hoped might occur in terms of him, getting over the playoff hiccups or pressure or whatever it was and really coming through in a big moment, the complete opposite was happening. And even as a team, whether Mitch was going to be willing to come back or not, they were going to have some hard conversations about, do we do this again? Like, we just saw this. Maybe the worst example yet. Like, twice at home, 5 and 7. The Leafs have had some pretty embarrassing Game 7 losses. I'm not sure it's ever been quite as, I already used the term violent, but like just slapped into your face, just punched into you that this group is not going to get it done. Last year they lost 2-1 to Boston in overtime in Game 7. You're like, you can talk yourself into that could have gone the other way, right? This was never going the other way. They got absolutely pummeled, and it was like an exclamation point on things need to change. And I think since that moment, and even in like locker cleanout day and stuff, Mitch was referring to his time in Toronto in the past tense. And you try not to read too much into things. Some people just speak differently, but you start to put it all together, and everything that he's been through and the organization's been through and the need for change and the fact that he has arrived this far or this close to his UFA days, you can add it all up and go, this guy's leaving. But Andy Strickland and an Alberta-based minor hockey podcast have confirmed it for us. Mitch is going to be gone. All right, that's probably enough for this week. Certainly enough of just me. These shows are always a little more fun when you can have a pint or two and kick it across the table with somebody. So hopefully this is the last time we do a Monday freak show. No promises that there won't be more midweek freak shows, but Monday should be with a guest. So we apologize for that, but appreciate you sticking with me and riding this through. Hope you took something away from it. Hope you enjoyed it a little bit. We're on social media at Tall Can Audio. Give us a follow there. Make sure you're subscribed to the pod, wherever you're hearing us right now. My name is Matt Robinson. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you all had a fantastic weekend. We'll see you later in the week.
I've got nothing here. You're giving me baseball and hockey, and I got my keister blowing in the wind. That made to look like a fool here. That's just dumb. I don't want anything to do with this place. This place is run by a bunch of children.